right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. Of course, we have the testimony by former FBI Director James Comey. We'll mention that along the way, but we have a lot of things to cover other than that because there are lots of issues in the news. One that I really want to call your attention to is a piece that we've posted by our good friend Robert Knight, From Suppression to Coercion. A lot that comes from this article, The New Abnormal. I'll explain more about that in just a minute. Of course, we always like to get an update from him on what is happening in the area of voting and voter registration and even this issue of Project Vote and some other things. Robert Knight, as you well know, he's been with us many times before as senior fellow at the American Civil Rights Union. He is a columnist. For example, we post many of his columns from the Washington Times. You can also find them in townhall.com. He's been an editor and writer for the Los Angeles Times. He's worked with a variety of organizations like the Family Research Council, the Heritage Foundation, Coral Ridge Ministries, Media Research Center, to mention just a few. And Robert Knight, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program.
Always a pleasure to be on, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, before we get into your articles, get your thoughts as an individual that worked for the Los Angeles Times and has been a media watcher. I get the sense that after the testimony today by James Comey, there's a little bit for everybody to actually have. In other words, if you work for CNN or MSNBC, say, well, maybe there's collusion, and look what Donald Trump said about asking for loyalty. If you're instead writing for the Washington Times or the Wall Street Journal or something like that, they're going to say, see, there's no problem here, nothing to look at. And it gets to me a sense that there won't be much difference in the coverage after the testimony, even though if you were willing to look at it with a little more objectivity, I think some of these fever swamp kinds of conspiracies died today, didn't they?
Well, they should have died, Kerby, but I think you're right. They won't. The media will continue to pound away, and they've kind of focused on this idea that Trump asked his FBI director to be loyal to him. This, of course, came at a time when the deep knives were out in the deep state, and he didn't know who to trust. And he was basically saying, hey, you're not going to do me in, are you? And leak things and things like that. That's what he was really asking. And there's nothing wrong with that. And yet the media made it out to be this horrible constitutional crisis of shared powers and everything else. They have blown this thing sky high. And there's still no evidence that Trump's campaign colluded with the Russians. I've never seen so much energy expended on something that has nothing there.
And again, you've lived up there, so you can relate to the comment that so many people say about the fact that Washington, D.C. is 20 miles outside of reality or common sense. And again, some of us on the hinterland say, the issues we really sent people to Washington to actually deal with, and this would be tax reform, health care reform, trying to maybe strengthen our borders, and as we'll talk about in just a minute, have some level of voter integrity. Those all get lost in all of this mudslinging, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And people think, gee, we elected Donald Trump to drain the swamp. Looks like the swamp is biting back hard. And the media are reporting only what they want to report. They keep losing credibility. That's the good thing to come out of this, Kerby, because people know that it can't be as bad as they say it is, because over and over it hasn't turned out as bad as they've said it is. So, Trump feeds them constantly with his tweets.
Yes.
He's doing it on purpose. He's not going to give that up, apparently. But I just read an article, I think it was in the Washington Post, which is no friend of Donald Trump's, and they said, you know what, this is actually not hurting his base at all. They're glad he continues to do it because they're afraid if he stops, it will be evidence that he's bought into the establishment way of doing things in Washington. I don't know about that, but that's one of the views out there.
Well, and again, recognizing the number of people that receive his tweet, those actually are numbers that are 2 times, 3 times, in some cases 4 or 5 times larger than the audience that criticize him. So it's kind of intriguing to see how he's done that. But let me get to the first article that we've posted here, From Suppression to Coercion. And Robert, one of the things that's caused me to maybe rethink how I communicate this is oftentimes I'll say that when we're dealing with whether it's Target or Home Depot or more recently the ESPN or whatever, I just say, they would be better if they stay out of the culture wars. But what you're reminding us of in this particular column is whether you're an individual or a business, of those on the left won't let you stay out of the culture wars. And the example that you use is the fact that when Tom Brady really said nothing about Donald Trump, that was not enough. As a matter of fact, that was enough for people to begin to start criticizing him.
Yeah, here's the Super Bowl quarterback who is a friend of Donald Trump's, and he was taken to task because he wouldn't clarify his relationship with Donald Trump. In fact, Sports Illustrated said he had every opportunity and he's mostly declined. And I'm thinking, who are they to force him to say something? Several other media operations did the same thing. They were all over him because he refused to denounce his friend Donald Trump. They went after the owner of the New England Patriots, Mr. Kraft, who was another friend of Donald Trump's, and he refused to disavow him as well. And one publication even wrote something he should be saying out there. It's like, come on, we're going beyond suppressing speech to saying you will say something or else. And yes, that's a kind of a chilling development.
Well, and you see that in some newsrooms. You tell the story there, being at the Los Angeles Times, where people would just rant and rave about Ronald Reagan, and then they'd look around and expect you to say something. And, I remember being at graduate school at Yale, and people would rant and rave about some issue, and they'd look at me like, okay, what are you going to say? So we've seen some of that in a kind of a small sector of society, in the newsrooms, maybe in the academy. But now we're seeing what developed there out in the mainstream press, where just by not saying something critical about Donald Trump or not affirming Caitlyn Jenner or whatever it might be is enough for you to not only be vilified, but it really, as you point out in the column, really borders on coercion, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. And here's a great pop culture example. Demi Lovato, the singer, she was in a video, and it appears she has dreadlocks, but she doesn't. She had hair twists. So some self-appointed culture commissar accused her of cultural appropriation.
Yes.
Because she's half white, half Hispanic. So she's not black, so how dare she wear something identified with blacks? So she tweeted like, oh, come on, they were twists, not dreads. And by the way, they look great. And so then she got attacked for not saying what they wanted to say. And in fact, let me read the quote from the columnist at MICCOM. She said, although Lovato was correct this time in telling her fans she wasn't actually wearing dreadlocks, this stands as an example for celebrities on how not to deny appropriation accusations. The appropriate response, another tweeter said, would be, I don't have dreads and I'd never be so culturally insensitive. It's lunacy to say that she's a bad person because she didn't condemn something she's never done.
Yes. And it reminds me, you've seen this before. There was a guy in Maryland, I believe, and he was using a word to describe somebody who's being stingy, but it sounded to some people like the N-word. And so he got vilified for that. And after a while, you have to not only think about what you might say, but whether somebody who's really stupid might not understand what you say because they might take it in the wrong direction. It's really gotten out of hand, but we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. We have a lot more to talk about with Robert Knight, and we will continue to do so right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Christians are surrounded by a supermarket of worldviews, so it's not surprising that many have uncritically accepted many of these false views of reality. The Barna Group, in association with Summit Ministries, conducted a survey of practicing Christians to determine how they were influenced by these worldviews. What they found is that younger Christians, that would be millennials and Generation X, were much more likely to accept unbiblical worldviews than previous generations. And they also found that males were more susceptible than females by a 2-to-1 ratio. They found that more than 6 in 10 of practicing Christians accept some ideas that are rooted in the new spirituality. They also found that more than a third of practicing Christians are sympathetic to some teachings of Islam. Apparently, these practicing Christians do not see how some of their views are illogical. For example, more than a quarter believe that all people pray to the same God or spirit. Praying to Allah, Krishna, or the God of the Bible would obviously be very different, but that does not seem to many of these Christians to be a contradiction. On issues of morality and values, many also differ from Orthodox Christianity. Nearly a quarter of them believe that what is morally right or wrong depends on what an individual believes. 1 in 5 believe that meaning and purpose come from working hard. A significant number also accept ideas promoted by socialism. Some strongly agree with the idea that the government, rather than individuals, should control as much of the resources as necessary to ensure that everyone gets a fair share, and others believe that private property encourages greed and envy. This survey is but one more reminder that we need to be teaching sound theology in our churches. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Robert Nye with us for a few more minutes talking about his column that appeared just recently in the Washington Times and Town Hall and other places, From Suppression to Coercion. And before we get into some of the conversation I want to have with you about voting and voter integrity and those kinds of issues, one of the paragraphs in your piece there talks about this professor at Evergreen State College. Now, Robert, every Wednesday we have kind of our millennial roundtable, and so it's not surprising over the last couple of weeks, every time we get into what is happening on campus, as bad as what has happened at all sorts of universities, from the University of California at Berkeley to various individuals around the country, what has been happening up at Evergreen State has really begun to explode. And one of the great ironies is this biology professor, who by his own admission is very liberal, progressive, would never have imagined that he would have to hold his biology class in a nearby park because of threats against him, simply because he said that maybe this day of absence where you want the white people to leave the campus, we'd be better if we stayed together and tried to work it out. And for that, he got labeled as a racist and had all sorts of threats against him.
Originally tried to hold his class on the day of absence, and 50 students came in and started screaming and disrupted, and he was forced to flee the campus. And they went on to take over the campus and hold it for several days. The most shocking thing, though, here, Kerby, is not that they are getting away with this, but that the college president actually issued a statement praising them, the thugs who took over his own campus and forced all whites off it, for their courage and their dedication and their passion. What kind of Stockholm syndrome is he suffering from? They trashed his campus, basically, and he's thanking them.
Yeah, at least $10,000 worth of damage. Now, to be fair, I'm noticing that now the Seattle Times and even the paper you used to work for, the Los Angeles Times, have gotten a little bit, New York Times and others have gotten a little bit more critical of that. But again, it's just the most bizarre thing happening on campus. And part of that is because there isn't any deterrence. But let me get to a couple of other issues, because you've written not only about back in May, criminals who appear to be voters and all those those people serving time that are still on Philadelphia's voting rolls we've talked about, but also now this Project Vote, which in large part was, I think, somewhat responsible for a rise of Barack Obama, first as a community organizer, then as a state senator, and eventually as a U.S. president. But you've been paying attention to some of this. It seems to me that we still have some very deep concerns about voter integrity, don't we?
Oh, we do, and we have to pay attention to groups like Project Vote because they are funded by George Soros, who is a left-wing billionaire, and their mission is to stop things like voter ID laws, which are common-sense safeguards, so everybody who votes is who they say they are. And I know Project Vote personally because I was down in Broward County, Florida, where the ACRU, the American Civil Rights Union, is suing the county for having corrupt voter rolls. And on the other side of the mediation table was sitting a guy from Project Vote. He was siding with the county, saying, no, they don't have to clean up their voter rolls. Well, the voter rolls have more than 100% of the population registered to vote. What does that tell you? It's a recipe for vote fraud. And but the good news is Project Vote on May 31st closed its doors.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it is amazing when you know a guy like George Soros was behind them with all his billions. But Soros, like other donors, still expects groups to raise their own money, and Project Vote was hemorrhaging money. I went on and looked at their 990, and they lost $750,000 in 2015. So I guess the losses were so much they finally closed. And I'm not going to rest easy, Kerby, because, the left is not through with this. They want to corrupt the voter rolls and make it easier to commit vote fraud. So they will redirect their efforts. But we could be happy about this one for now.
And again, that one just came out recently. Let's just for a minute talk about that because I know the American Civil Rights Union has been really pursuing this. And there's a very good reason to do so because, Robert, as you well know, one of the lines we get from the Brennan Center, what do we get from a variety of liberals is there's no voter fraud. And I always like to point to the individuals that are actually doing time in prison and others that are being prosecuted for voter fraud. So to say that with a straight face takes a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's absurd. There's vote fraud all over America. If you don't believe it, just go to our companion website, Voting Integrity Institute. We chronicle it constantly. There are all kinds of examples there. The Heritage Foundation also has a bank of voter fraud cases that's in the hundreds now. Here's the problem, Kerby. There should be thousands of cases, but most prosecutors don't go after it because it's hard to prove. The penalties aren't very big. And they're dealing with all sorts of other crimes that the citizens want them to take on. So a lot of vote fraud goes under the table. But that doesn't mean it's any less harmful to our self-governing republic. There are a lot of close elections around the country that have been decided by a few hundred votes. The Attorney General in Virginia, for instance, was decided by a few hundred votes. Then we find out there were lots of felons registered to vote and non-citizens in Northern Virginia. And of course, the most famous example, I think, is Al Franken's election in 2008 in Minnesota, when he became the 60th vote for Obamacare. He was unseating a sitting U.S. Senator, Norm Coleman, and then Coleman appeared to beat him, but they kept recounting votes. They found some in car trunks.
Yes.
Then they found out later at least 1,000 felons who cannot vote legally were on the voting rolls and probably voted for Franken. And then they finally came up with 312 vote margin for Franken, seating him as a U.S. Senator. I think he stole the election. It's very simple, and that's just the tip of the iceberg.
And so, again, we also posted one in the past that you can see about the voter rolls having a lot of people that have served time. But there's another issue that surfaced in Montana. You might remember the story that came out about Greg Gianforte, who body slammed an individual. I won't get into what he did or didn't do, but the point is that after that happened, there were a lot of people that said, well, I want my ballot back. And I said, well, this is the problem you have with early voting. Once you vote, anything that happens after you voted cannot really influence your vote. But there's a bigger issue, and certainly you've written about this, and John Fund has written about this as well. When you have all of these absentee ballots, and in Oregon, all of them are, you don't have any kind of enforcement. You don't have anybody who is right there to actually give some supervision. And so without the supervision of election officials, it does seem that that's another place where there is a lot of possibility for voter mischief, isn't there?
Oh, that's the easiest way to commit vote fraud, with absentee ballots. In fact, there's a case unfolding right now in Texas where they found 700 ballots that were listed with this one guy's name, who they haven't tracked down yet. And in a couple communities, some senior citizens said this guy came around and asked for their absentee ballot and said he would handle it for them. and they realized that they were victims of vote fraud. Mm-hmm. And that's just one case in Texas, and that's 700 ballots right there. The governor has announced an investigation into the whole thing. But think about that. Like you said, Oregon, it's all absentee balloting. California is moving in that direction. Other states are too. Between early voting, absentee balloting, same-day registration, they're trying to make it very difficult to police the voting system and make sure people are who they say they are when they vote. And that's not good.
Well, again, you can find all of that at the American Civil Rights Union. Of course, it has a link to voter integrity as well. We've posted some of the columns by Robert Knight. And Robert, again, I would encourage people to especially get this one, From Suppression to Coercion. Read it, print it out, and then maybe click that share button and put it on your Facebook page or send it out on Twitter and help people realize that we're moving into a time where we really kind of need to stand up for our rights and recognize that even remaining silent is not enough for certain individuals. So I appreciate the great writing that you do and look forward to the next opportunity we can get you here on Point of View.
I really enjoy being on with you, Kerby. God bless you.
Okay. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some of these issues, give you a little bit of an update on what has been transpiring in the conversation and the testimony by James Comey and some of the commentary that's now coming out as a result of that. So if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Gary Bauer will be with us, and we'll be looking at not only that testimony, but during this particular month of Ramadan, this has been a time in which you've had what many people call a Ramadan rampage. So we're going to talk about why that is happening, what we can address and say about that, and give you a chance to join the conversation here as well. In the second hour, by the way, I might just mention that John Stonestreet will be with us. We'll be talking about his new book, A Practical Guide to Culture, Helping the Next Generation Navigate Today's World. So we've got all sorts of things to cover, and a lot of that material that we are talking about today is on the website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to read this particular piece on From Suppression to Coercion, or one on the Ramadan Rampage, those are just a few issues that are already on the Point of View webpage. We appreciate you visiting it and even leaving a donation if you can. We'll be back with more right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to bring to the microphone now Gary Bauer, who served under Ronald Reagan for 8 years, first as Undersecretary of Education and then Chief Domestic Policy Advisor. Of course, now he is the President of American Values, Chairman of the Campaign for Working Families. We always encourage you to get his end-of-day report. We've published one on our website here, so you can find a link on the Ramadan Rampage, and we'll talk about this very dangerous month and also what has happened in London, and also try to get some perspective on the 50th anniversary of the 1967 Six-Day War. So, Gary Bauer, always great to have you on the program with us.
Thank you, Kerby. Always good to be with you, particularly on a newsworthy day like today with everything going on in Washington, D.C.
Well, I wanted to have you first, of course, talk a little bit about James Comey and the testimony. Some have referred to it as a nothing burger, or others have said, well, this just proves again that we have collusion. I'm afraid everybody's going to look at this testimony and come away with their preconceived ideas, and the media won't stop its drumbeat. But what's your thought today?
Well, that's a pretty good summary, Kerby. Look, obviously, I come from a conservative perspective on this, but to me, there were some really important things that were set on the record by former FBI Director Comey. One of those things being that it was accurate when President Trump said that he was told 3 times by Mr. Comey that he, the president, was not under investigation. That was the truth when Donald Trump said that, and Comey confirmed that today. He also confirmed that nobody told him to stop the investigation on whether there was collusion with Russia. Third, Comey admitted that Donald Trump said to him, look, if anybody in my orbit has had inappropriate conversations or collusion with Russia, I want to know. Let's get to the bottom of it so we can deal with these people. Let's get it over with. So that was very significant. In other words, he was not only not discouraging the Russian investigation, he was urging it on, encouraging Comey to do that.
That's a good point.
And then one of the things that I thought was just extraordinary is that Comey admitted that he leaked his account of a meeting between himself and the president to a friend and told that friend to leak it to the news media. And of course, it's an account of a meeting between he and the president that is not particularly friendly to the president. So here we've been going on for months. Who are these leakers that are manipulating national security information and so forth? We discovered today that one of those leakers is the former FBI director himself. And I'm kind of amazed, just looking at the news so far today, how few people in the so-called mainstream media are focused on the fact that Comey admitted under oath today that he was one of the leakers.
Well, again, you heard it first from Gary Bauer, and hopefully we'll hear more of it later on. Another good reason to make sure that you get some of the great material from Gary Bauer's American Values, as well as to be listening to Point of View. I did, before time runs away from us, want to spend a little bit of time. The original idea was to get you on here so that we could talk about the 50th anniversary of the 1967 Six-Day War. We have covered some of that. We've had Gordon Robertson in studio and encouraged people to go to the movie in our hands. But I still think this is important because, Gary, one of the things we're recognizing is we're trying to reach out more and more to our younger audience. We had yesterday our Millennial Roundtable where everybody is really younger than some of my kids, but nevertheless, there are a lot of them that simply do not know the story. And this could have been the end of the nation of Israel. And as a friend of Israel, can you speak to the importance of this 50th anniversary?
Well, absolutely. 50 years ago, the Arab Muslim countries in the region were getting ready to launch a massive attack on Israel. There were at least 6 nations involved. They had overwhelming superiority in men and equipment, and by almost any other measurement, they were. Each of these nations, Egypt, other countries, were massing their forces ready for the attack. And Israel intelligence, of course, was picking this up. And they decided that their only chance was to strike first, which they did. And within a very short period of time, it was called the Six-Day War, they had overcome that Arab military force, had liberated and reunited, liberated East Jerusalem and reunited it with West Jerusalem. And if that war had gone the other way, there would be no Israel today.
Well, and again, it also illustrates the importance of Jerusalem itself. And I thought for a while there that this president might actually fulfill a campaign promise that virtually every president has made, and that is to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But not yet. But if there's ever a president that might do it, it might be this one. What's your thoughts?
Yes, we have high expectations that he will do it. Both he and the vice president and others in the administration has suggested that this is a temporary delay. I think the embassy will move. This is the only place in the world where we and other nations don't put our embassy in the city that nation says is its capital. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Jews have been living in Jerusalem for several thousand years. And by the way, to all of our Christian listeners, which is, I'm sure, the overwhelming majority of your listeners, if Jews weren't in Jerusalem for thousands of years, then the whole Christian narrative is a myth. Because anybody that has studied the Bible knows that Jesus and his parents and all the disciples and the patriarchs and every story of consequence in the Bible is a story involving the Jews that lived in the Holy Land. And so we have it in our own most important book, a book that we believe is God's inspired word. And we know that the efforts to delegitimize the presence of Jews in the Holy Land is also an attack by radical Islam and the United Nations to delegitimize the Christian narrative.
Let me also talk about something else, because we've posted your end-of-day report from Monday because it had that whole section there on the Ramadan rampage. And we spent a little bit of time, Gary, earlier in the week explaining why Ramadan is so dangerous. I mean, last year, during the so-called holy month of Islam, 421 dead, 729 wounded. As you well know, as we look at this increasing body count, this is such a dangerous time in the year for Christians who are seen as infidels, for Jews who are seen as infidels, but oftentimes even for other Muslims. And whether you look at the Philippines and the casino in Manila, whether you see the attack on Coptic Christians in Egypt or the suicide vehicle in Kabul, or, of course, the most important one that's been in everybody's minds, the various attacks in London, this is a dangerous time, and it's certainly an illustration, again, that many people might refer to this as a religion of peace, but not everybody got the memo.
Well, you're sure right about that. You know, a few weeks ago, the Jews celebrated the holiday that marks what tradition teaches them is the time when God handed down the Ten Commandments to Moses. And last Sunday was Pentecost Sunday, in which Christians celebrate that event, Christ ascending to be with the Father in heaven, and the followers of Christ being able to speak in multiple languages so that people from all around the known world could understand the message that they were delivering. In those two very important holidays, there was not an uptick in Jews going around killing people.
That's right.
Or Christians running out of churches and launching attacks on people that aren't Christians. But every year now, for some time, when it gets to be Ramadan, intelligence agencies and people that live in majority Muslim countries or in nations that are close to Muslim countries, it is well known that Ramadan, which is supposed to be a time of reflection and fasting, is a time when radical Islamic supremacists end up killing and attacking those that are not Muslims, and as you said, those Muslims who they believe are not sufficiently devout.
Incredible. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue for just a few more minutes with Gary Bauer. He's been gracious enough to join us today, and if you'd like to join our conversation, if not this hour or the next, 1-800-351-1212. Been talking about Ramadan. We've talked certainly about the Six-Day War. Do want to get a few comments about Islamist extremism. That's what the Prime Minister in the UK said. What about that? We'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. An editorial penned in the Tampa Bay Times has called for one of our clients to form a league of their own. The author writes about Cambridge Christian School, who earned the chance to play for a state football championship game against another Christian school. Both teams asked the Florida High School Athletic Association to pray over the public address system prior to kickoff. That request was denied by the FHSAA, specifically because the requested speech was religious in nature. The author supports the FHSAA. He writes, if Cambridge and similar schools want public community prayer before their state championship games, they should leave the FHSAA and form their own private statewide Christian association and stage their own playoffs. Now, we were once told that if you wanted to pray in school, you should go to a private Christian school. These students did, but now that they are there, this author would have them leave the league entirely. Well, where does it end? Must religious picnickers form their own private parks lest they be accused of violating the Constitution for saying grace over their meal at a public park? It was the FHSAA that engaged in religious discrimination against Cambridge Christian School. It would be an even greater offense to the Constitution's protection of religious liberty to force these students further from public participation. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us today Gary Bauer for just a few more minutes, President of American Values, also the chairman of Campaign for Working Families and the author of the End of Day Report, which we certainly encourage you to get more information about. We have that link on our website, pointofview.net. We wanted to get some phone calls, but if somebody can put that first caller on the line for me, wanted to go to him and get some comments in Louisiana. Thank you for calling today. You're on with Gary Bauer.
Hey, thanks for taking my call, by the way. Yeah, my question about Ramadan is they call that a holy holiday or something like that from Islam. And my question to y'all and to them is how can holy and destruction and killing be in the same sentence?
Well, again,
and I'm going to...
yeah. And one of the questions I have, Gary, we might talk about that, is because it's a time in which there is fasting from the first prayer of the day at dawn all the way to the fourth prayer, which is after sunset. It's a time when there's supposed to be fervent prayer, but for those who are radical, they believe that there would be the greatest reward for some kind of jihad during this time. Isn't that what's going on?
I think that's exactly what's going on. And, I think, Kerby, you and I both want to continually remind people that many Muslims during that period of time obviously don't go out and kill people.
Right.
And they do use it as a time to rededicate themselves to their faith. But again, when a Christian becomes more devout, his neighbors don't have anything to worry about. I mean, you're more likely, if you've got a devout Christian neighbor who becomes more devout, that he'll pay you back the money he owes you, that he's not going to attempt to seduce your spouse or take something that belongs to you for himself. But in significant parts of the Muslim world, the more devout the Muslim, the more likely they are to be involved in very aggressive and, as we see in many cases, violent activities that threaten their neighbors and those that don't believe. I mean, this is why I think it's just kind of silly for political leaders who are not Muslims to lecture us about the real Islam and how many people believe this or how many people believe that. And all due respect to the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Mrs. May, she has no idea what the real teachings are. She's not an expert on Islam. All we can look at is what happens during these periods of time And we can look at what is the status of majority Muslim countries around the world. And as we've talked about before, if you look around the world, whether it's Indonesia or Saudi Arabia, majority Muslim countries are generally not good places for women, and they are not places that tend to recognize religious pluralism and the right of minority religious faiths to worship in peace. So while we have big controversies in the United States about whether another mosque should be built here or there, the fact is every year more and more mosques are built, but there are no churches or synagogues in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
There's one Jew left in Afghanistan. Christians in Egypt are routinely attacked and murdered. And in fact, Kerby, I know you saw that story about the Coptic Christians the other day that were pulled off of a bus, and this a terrible story. But they were pulled out and asked to renounce Jesus, to say the Muslim pledge and renounce Jesus. And according to eyewitnesses, many of those people broke out singing hymns while they were shot. That is what happens to religious minorities in Muslim majority countries. And it's something that as Americans we need to face as being factual and true, and ask why that's the case.
You mentioned the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, who used that phrase, Islamist extremism. And I like what Andrew McCarthy said. He said this illustrates what he says, the Western schizophrenia about radical Islam. Because if you're an Islamist in the West, you are by definition an extremist. That is a person who believes in the imposition of Sharia. And the point he's making is that sometimes we try to make the distinction between those who are violent and those that are not. But what he's trying to say is that if you're a Muslim and you want British law or even the American Constitution supplanted by Islamic law, then it really is almost incidental as to whether or not you're going to go into a nightclub in Orlando and kill someone or drive a van into pedestrians in London, because sooner or later you really want to implement that Muslim view of Sharia, which, as you point out, is never good for those who are not Muslims, never good for women in a court of law, and bring about a level of totalitarian action that we have fought against for actually millennia.
Absolutely. The idea that if Europe replaces its regular population with larger and larger numbers of people coming from third world Muslim cultures, that Europe will not be any different, that it will still be free, that freedom of religion will be allowed, freedom of speech, that the opportunities for women will be the same, is really just naive. In fact, I'm not aware of any previous civilization that's ever tried an experiment of bringing in millions of people that don't share their basic values and believe in the belief that it won't change their country. You know, Kerby, I could the wounded to the hospitals in London the other day to be treated, many of them in critical condition after that terrorist attack. Those are the same hospitals that, you know, on another floor are maternity wards where the majority of male babies in London are being named on birth the name Muhammad.
Yes.
Well, is the London of 20 years from now going to be the same London today as a free city? If the majority of citizens of London are in fact Muslims that believe in Sharia law, if they are, I'd like somebody to point for me to the country in the world, wherever it is, that has majority Muslim population that observes the things we're talking about: religious liberty, the right to follow faiths other than Islam, the right to build a church, the right for Jews to have free speech and assemble, etc. There's virtually no examples of that from one end of the Muslim world to the other.
Let me encourage you to go to ouramericanvalues.org, or, of course, we already have posted today the Monday special alert that has the Ramadan rampage and did Theresa May wake up, including that quote there about Muhammad, the children being born that have the name Muhammad. And so we've given that to you so that you can, first of all, read it, pass it on to your friends, but most importantly, sign up and find out a little bit more every single day what Gary Bauer and his staff consider most important. We always say it's a must read. And so, Gary Bauer, I appreciate the fact that you write that every day for us, and I appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's always a pleasure for me to be with you. You do a great job, and I look forward to the next time we have a chance to talk.
I know you were out traveling, so it meant a lot that you could join us today. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we have a lot more to cover, so feel free if you'd like to join us. I'm sorry we had a little problem with the phones there. We got one line through. We'll get the others fixed, and we'll be glad to have that opportunity to interact with you. We're privileged to have with us by phone in the next hour John Stonestreet. We're going to be talking about his book, The Practical Guide to Culture, Helping the Next Generation Navigate Today's World. Just a very well-written book. An individual we certainly appreciated over the years, and certainly one of those individuals who writes the daily commentary for Breakpoint. So somebody else that you need to know as the president of the Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview. So let's take a break. If you'd like some more information, visit our website, pointofview.net. And, of course, that also gives you a link to ouramericanvalues.org. We'll be back with more right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we get a chance to talk with our good friend John Stonestreet, who's the president of the Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview. We have a link to that website, and of course he has written a number of books: Restoring All Things, Same-Sex Marriage, Making Sense of Your World, to mention just a few. And this book, which we're going to focus some time and attention on this hour, over 300 pages of very good material. It is entitled A Practical Guide to Culture, Helping the Next Generation Navigate Today's World. And it is endorsed by all sorts of individuals that have been on this program before that you will really appreciate. This would include such people as Eric Metaxas and John Daly and Jeff Myers. By the way, Jeff will be on with us next week. J. Warner Wallace and Rod Dreyer, Trevin Wax, Sean McDowell, and Kathy Cook. So again, this is just a resource that I really want to put in your hands. It is published by David C. Cook. You can probably find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link for you to find it there as well as a link to, of course, the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. John Stonestreet, always love to have you on the program with us.
Well, I always love to be on the program with you, Kerby. Thanks so much.
You know, most parents are convinced that our culture is changing, and there's a very good reason to believe that. And we're feeling a lot of pressure. And when we had Rod Dreyer on recently, we talked about this idea of the Benedict option, and not that we need to join a monastery, but we really need to think about these smartphones. When we've had Kathy on, we've talked about screens and teens. I think every parent recognizes that it's been difficult to raise kids, but in this 21st century, and you've got kids of your own, this is really a challenge, isn't it?
Oh, it really is. I mean, if you ask my co-author, Brett Kunkel, why he decided to write this book, he'll say he has 5 reasons, and those are his 5 kids. And if you ask me, I'll say I have 4 reasons, and those are my 4 kids. I mean, in a lot of ways, we wanted to go deep in a lot of these issues that we knew our kids would have to face. But Kerby, there's no question. I mean, it's always hard to raise kids. It's always hard to raise kids in a cultural context. But there's so many moving pieces right now in our culture. There's so many things, shifting and changing, and it seems to happen so quickly. It's just like we're getting hit by cultural wave after cultural wave. That it really leaves parents, many of them thinking, well, I just can't keep up. But at the same level, sending our kids unaided into this culture is not an option, right? I mean, we've got to do something. And so we wanted this book to be as practical as possible, but also as helpful as possible in terms of identifying the issues that matter the most.
Yes. Let's talk about culture for just a minute. It's something that we think we know what it is, but you took a little bit of time in the early part of the book talking about that culture and recognizing that culture is surrounding us. So just like you don't want to ask a fish what water is, you don't want to ask people about a culture because we breathe it, we live it. But at the same time, it's important for us to step back for just a minute and understand the culture that we're in, isn't it?
No, it really is. And I think especially at a time of cultural upheaval, which is kind of what we've kind of experienced as Christian parents and Christian mentors of the next generation, that it's easy then to, as Christians, just define culture as all the bad stuff that happens out there. But we have to be really clear on what culture is. Culture itself isn't bad. The fact that culture exists is a result of the way God made us to make something of the world. We don't just live in the world and consume its resources. We make the world into what it is. It doesn't mean we always do a great job, and that's really the pain points that we identify in the book, that there's a lot of things that are going the wrong direction. But we wanted to start the book with that sort of clarity, in particular the clarity that says, look, culture isn't the final say on reality. Culture is what we do with reality, and if we do things that are counter to reality, reality's still going to have the final say. And the most real thing that's ever happened in the history of the world, of course, is that Christ has risen from the dead, defeated sin and death, period. And so we can always have hope as Christians in this particular cultural moment, even one like the one that we face now, where so many things seem up in the air. And, of course, we think about our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world where being a Christian means facing incredible persecution, not just upheaval, but persecution. And still, this is what's so necessary to remember, is that the Christianity and the resurrected Christ is more true than the cultural moment. And we have to make sense of the culture from that perspective, not trying to rethink and renegotiate Christian truth based on a changing culture.
Privileged to have with us today John Stonestreet, co-author of the book, as he mentioned just a minute ago with Brett Kunkel, A Practical Guide to Culture, Helping the Next Generation Navigate Today's World. And it is published by David C. Cook. It's just a book I certainly believe needs to be on your shelf. If you have children or grandchildren, that's reason enough. Even as you kind of understand what's going on in the culture, this will be very helpful to you. And one of the things I thought we might talk about, John, for just a minute, is you're not talking about drawing lines. As a matter of fact, you refer to that as kind of the line approach, and it's too simplistic. And in some respects, that's easy if we just say, okay, here are the do's and here are the don'ts, and just be legalistic about it. But that's not what you're calling for at all, is it?
No, it's not. And look, we have to draw lines, and we have to get there eventually. But to start there and just say, okay, well, this is a simple way to go through. We'll just draw a line and say that all movies are bad, or listening to anything that, isn't quote unquote Christian music, is bad. And so we draw these kind of artificial lines. The problem with that is a couple-fold. Number one is that that helps us kind of stay away from the culture, but that assumes we're called to stay away from the culture. We're not. I mean, God actually created us to create culture, and I'd argue that Jesus Christ saves us so that he can recreate us to become culture creators in a brand new way. And, of course, we want our kids not just to survive the culture. We want them to grow into the fullness of their calling. God has equipped some to be creators, and some to be, inventors, and some to be imaginers, and some to be investors. And you can kind of go down the line and think about all the ways that humans can make a difference in the world. We don't want to draw a line and keep kids away from that with these kind of artificial categories of lines. So what we do is, again, in that framing at the very beginning of the book, is say, okay, here's what culture is. Now, what does God expect of his church? What is the relationship between Christians and culture? Now, of course, Kerby, you know this as well as anybody. A lot has been written on the relationship between Christianity and culture in an academic level. But throughout this entire book, we wanted to make it as practical and usable and helpful in a framing sort of way for, parents and mentors and educators and teachers and youth pastors, so that they could have the benefit of some of this kind of terrific scholarly writing, but maybe in an accessible way.
Well, again, we'll look at this maybe after the break, but I want to talk about, what Paul and Jesus and others call for us, because Paul talks about this minister of reconciliation, that we should have a ministry of reconciliation. We're certainly to be in the world, but not of the world. And you really make a case, this one's kind of jarring for, I think, some people, that God even determines our cultural moment. We were born for a time such as this. It really plays well when we talk about Esther or people like that. But then we go, really? This is the world that I'm supposed to raise my children or my grandchildren in? So we're going to take a break and continue our conversation today with John Stonestreet. And let me just mention, we have some resources that I think you would find helpful. First of all, a link to the Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Then we have information about this book. It's over 300 pages, and it really is a practical guide to culture, helping the next generation navigate today's world. Now, there's quite a good possibility that when you go into your local bookstore, you can find it. It's published by David C. Cook. But if you cannot find it and would like to get it in hardback or like to get it in Kindle, we've made those connections easy for you as well. All available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with our good friend John Stonestreet right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, Christians are surrounded by a supermarket of worldviews, so it's not surprising that many have uncritically accepted many of these false views of reality. The Barna Group, in association with Summit Ministries, conducted a survey of practicing Christians to determine how they were influenced by these worldviews. What they found is that younger Christians, that would be millennials and Generation X, were much more likely to accept unbiblical worldviews than previous generations. And they also found that males were more susceptible than females by a 2-to-1 ratio. They found that more than 6 in 10 of practicing Christians accept some ideas that are rooted in the new spirituality. They also found that more than a third of practicing Christians are sympathetic to some teachings of Islam. Apparently, these practicing Christians do not see how some of their views are illogical. For example, more than a quarter believe that all people pray to the same God or spirit. Praying to Allah, Krishna, or the God of the Bible would obviously be very different, but that does not seem to many of these Christians to be a contradiction. On issues of morality and values, many also differ from Orthodox Christianity. Nearly a quarter of them believe that what is morally right or wrong depends on what an individual believes. 1 in 5 believe that meaning and purpose come from working hard. A significant number also accept ideas promoted by socialism. Some strongly agree with the idea that the government, rather than individuals, should control as much of the resources as necessary to ensure that everyone gets a fair share, and others believe that private property encourages greed and envy. This survey is but one more reminder that we need to be teaching sound theology in our churches. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John Stonestreet with us today, co-author of the book A Practical Guide to Culture, Helping the Next Generation Navigate Today's World, published by David C. Cook. And just before we get into some of the practical ones, let's, if we can, just for a theological moment or two, talk about this idea of being a minister of reconciliation, of having a ministry of reconciliation, and the fact that really God determines our cultural moments. So we are, if nothing else, brought for a time such as this.
You know, Kerby, if somebody decided to build computers and just bought a bunch of computer parts but didn't have any idea what success was at the end of the day, what kind of computer they were going to, build, it wouldn't be a very good project. You have to have an end in mind. And a lot of time, I think parents approach helping their kid through culture without kind of having a view of success. So we kind of punt to this safety approach, which is let's just stay safe at all costs from the dangers of culture. But that's not taking into mind what does God want our kids to be in this cultural moment. And there's two things that we bring up in the book. The first is a truth that Paul brings out on his sermon at Mars Hill to the men of Athens, the Epicureans and the Stoics. And he says that God determines the times that people live in the boundaries of their dwelling place. So it's no accident that we live in this cultural moment and not in another. We might wish for the good old days, and there might have been some good old days, at least compared to where we're at today. But at the same time, we didn't make that choice. God actually determined the time and place in which we are to live. And so what does that look like for the believer? Well, Paul's really clear about that in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, as he talks about that we're made into a new creation. And we know that that's the result of coming to faith in Christ. But Paul goes further and says, and you were reconciled essentially. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. So those who have been reconciled to God in Christ are to become reconcilers. So if it's not an accident that we're supposed to be in this cultural moment, and we know that our job description is to be a reconciler, that's success. We don't just want our kids to make it out of this culture, with their virginity or with their, with kind of their just, kind of a basic level faith, that's, protected and insulated from the world. God wants to grow them into whatever arena he's gifted them and sent them into as someone who can tangibly take the gospel and become a reconciler in force, in whatever cultural arena, whatever cultural sphere that they find themselves in.
Let's talk about the culture in which they are actually located, and it's an information age. But you make the case that it's really an age of ideas. It's more than just information, and you really talk about the fact that kids kind of struggle, even at the end.
Whether it's not authoritative and needs to be, I hate to use the phrase fake news, but here we are, right? I mean, it really is true. Information is not the same thing as wisdom. And if we're not discerning, we're destined to be brainwashed or deceived.
One of the things that you certainly talk about in this book and in virtually almost every one of your Breakpoint commentaries, and certainly as you go to the website for the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, is this idea of developing a worldview and helping people think worldviewishly. This book, I think, is an attempt by you and Brett to help parents first think about how to develop a worldview and to think worldviewishly, and then to figure out how to pass that on to our kids. And I certainly would recommend any young person going off to college, go to the Probe Mind Games, go to Summit Ministries. We're going to have Jeff Meyer on next week. Of course, you know him very well. And of course, you've taught there as well. They're just opportunities for us as well as for people we can bring alongside to educate our kids so that they're not just taking information in bits and bytes, but they're putting it in some kind of meaningful whole.
No, that's exactly right. And the key word here is intentionality. Most people and most students get a worldview like they get a cold. They just catch it from their culture. And so our goal in this book, A Practical Guide to Culture, is to help parents be intentional with their kids, to help them to realize what are those things that are shaping the worldview of their kids, whether it's good or bad, true or false, and then to counter those things. And listen, if we can just teach, as Nancy Pearcey said in her great book on worldview, if we can just teach the next generation to keep on their baloney detector, I mean, if that's all we get, just keep your baloney detector on, we're way ahead. Because culture is most powerful, not in what it argues, but as C.S. Lewis said, in what it assumes. And just the things that it presents as normal, right? When a debate is over in a culture is when that idea is the most powerful. When it's still up for grabs, it's going to make a lot of noise. That's why some of these undercurrents that we identify, I think, are so important, because we've got to be intentional. And to be intentional, we got to be aware of what's going on. So we walk through some of these things in order to do that. But there's nothing more significant a parent can give their kid than an intentionally developed Christian worldview.
Just before we take a break, since I've been talking about this wonderful website of yours, colsoncenter.org, as people go there, talk about what is available, because in addition to this book, in addition to, of course, the Breakpoint commentaries you do and other things, there are all sorts of resources, and especially during this summer, this would be a great time to say, we're not going to just let you sit around and veg out and let's watch TV and look at your smartphone. This could be a time where we could, with intentionality, begin to educate you on some of those issues. So what's available at the Colson Center to help out parents and grandparents?
Well, a lot like Point of View, which is why we love so much what you guys do, Kerby. If you go to Breakpoint, what you'll find is just an analysis on a daily basis, both through Breakpoint and through The Point, of just the top news stories from a Christian worldview. I love when I travel and people come up and say, you're part of our family. I'm like, well, what do you mean? He said, well, we get Breakpoint every day. We print it out because you can subscribe to it by email. We print it out or we talk about it at dinner time. And that becomes our conversation with our teenagers, with our young adults, and even among couples of, this is what's happening in the world. How should a Christian think? And that's kind of like the tip of the funnel. And then we populate. My colleague Warren Cole Smith on a weekly basis has his weekly column called Signs and Wonders, where he talks about, in just a quick nugget format, hear some key stories of the week and a Christian Worldview slant on all of those sorts of things. We've got a podcast that you can subscribe to 3 times a week with different teaching, with interviews, a weekly show that Ed Stetzer from Wheaton College and I do together on the stories of the week. But it's that intersection of faith and culture, and I'm fascinated by that intersection because I think our faith allows us to understand the culture correctly. And you're right. What a chance this summer to get ahead of that. What a chance to go to a conference together, to read a book together, and to dig deep into what faith has to say about the world.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we've been talking about some of the undercurrents. We'll talk about some of those pounding cultural waves as we talk about the book, A Practical Guide to Culture. We'll be back right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this. are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with John Stonestreet, co-author of the book, A Practical Guide to Culture, helping the next generation navigate today's world. And we've looked at some of these undercurrents. Now we're going to get into some of the pounding cultural waves. And I know, John, this is why you wrote the book, because not only did you want to help establish kind of a philosophical and theological structure, but you wanted to address a lot of those practical issues. And one of those, obviously, we've already alluded to, is pornography. And it is something that we've talked about with Josh McDowell and Noel Boucher of Pure Hope and others. We recognize the problem, but again, what advice might you give to parents and grandparents that are concerned about the porno plague here in the 21st century? Well, maybe we lost John Stonestreet. We'll see if we can get him back here. And while we do that, we'll certainly continue talking about the book for just a few minutes. It is, as I pointed out, a practical guide to help kids navigate common cultural challenges without drowning. And again, as we've mentioned, a lot of parents are feeling the pressure of an ever-changing culture that are surrounding their kids. So it's sometimes really easy to feel like you're kind of lost in this circumstance. And John, let me see if we have you now. We were talking about the subject of pornography.
Yeah, sorry about that. An Amber Alert came across my phone and shut the whole system down there. So
that's understandable.
Yeah, well, listen, no, it is. I remember sitting with Josh McDowell, since you mentioned that name, at an airport when my oldest daughter was probably only 5 or 6, and he said something that almost made my heart stop. He's like, listen, you have to understand as a dad, the issue is not, will my kids see pornography? It's when and what happens next. And that's the thing about porn. It's predatory. And we have to understand that. We can't make any bones about it. And there's a couple things I think we can specifically do. On a worldview level, the first thing we have to do is help students understand what sex is for. This is one of the most important things that I think many of us miss when it comes to pornography or the hookup culture or any of the other things we deal with in the book, is that we're talking about sex and these issues with our kids in a context in which sex has lost its purpose. Sex has lost its meaning in our culture. So we've got to start by not just telling kids what to do sexually and what not to do sexually, but helping them understand what God created sex for.
Right.
When you understand the value of sex, then the what. When you understand the why of sex, the what of sex makes a lot more sense. Now, that's not all. Second thing we got to do is we have to have a close relationship with our kids so that they know that pornography is coming before they see it. We can't wait until it comes after them and finds them before they know that it's out there. They need to know about it and be on the lookout. We've had such, interesting conversations with my kids who are, my daughters are 12 and almost 10 and almost 8. And we've talked about things like same-sex marriage and LGBT issues and pornography at different levels with each of them to get ahead of the culture. We can't always choose the timing of it, of when they're going to get exposed. So to get ahead of it as quickly as possible is huge. And then let me just say this, Kerby. You can call this the Joseph principle. You can call this just the practical thing to do. But there's an old saying, geography has a lot to do with purity. And I'm thinking of Joseph here, when Potiphar's wife tempted him over and over and over. And he said no, and he said no, and he said no. But one day he got out of there. So something happened, and he actually had to remove himself from the temptation. It is insane. I'm just going to say it this way. Forgive me for being so blunt, but it is insane for a middle schooler or a high schooler to have unfettered, unaccountable, unfiltered access to the internet in the privacy of their bedrooms. I mean, that is just like giving kids a blowtorch and saying, don't play with fire. I mean, it's insane. And so half of this thing is geography, is just set up appropriate boundaries. I'm still amazed by the number of parents who think it's scandalous to know their kids' passwords, like they're violating their privacy and so on and so on. Listen, what is at stake is their souls. Yes, teach them responsibility, grant them more and more privacy, but don't let them just take a poisonous snake into their bedroom and expect nothing bad to happen. We've got to have that relationship, that conversation, we've got to have some of those practical boundaries in place as well.
You know, last night I was in a board meeting with Joe McElhaney, who you quote the book, Hooked: New Science on How Casual Sex is Affecting Our Children. And they're even redoing the book and adding new material. Of course, Josh McDowell has as well. So whether you talk about pornography or this, what you call the hookup culture, we have to recognize that we now know a lot more about the dangers to our children than we did before. Now, we knew there were sexually transmitted diseases, but we had no idea of some of the impact that it was having on the brain chemistry and everything else. So this is why it's even more important for intentionality, for parents to, like you said, know the kid's password, to be a Facebook friend, to understand that even when they're at home, you need to do some monitoring when you can. Of course, they now have smartphones that allow them to see a lot of things that we used to be able to monitor when we had a whole family computer in the living room. But nevertheless, it's much more important for us to be involved than ever before because we know what the stakes are.
Yeah, that's right. We do know what the stakes are. And listen, again, I'm going to go back. Let's not underestimate the practical value of teaching kids what sex is for. We need to understand that our cultural moment is very thoroughly determined by the lies of the sexual revolution. And the lies of the sexual revolution are numerous. I mean, one of them is that sex, marriage, and babies are separable. This is a great line from Jenny Morse from the Ruth Institute. Sex, marriage, and babies are separable, and men and women are interchangeable. But another one is that sex is somehow we can separate the physical from the spiritual, or our bodies, what we do with our bodies, as if we're just kind of animals, and it doesn't really affect our souls. And like you say, and Joe McElhaney does a great job. We quote him in several places in the book because he points out how it's not just a physical thing. It actually does damage us and so on. But in this context, the first and foremost thing we need to do is help kids understand sex and understand that sex is a part of a context and it's part of a design. So one of the strategies we give kids, parents in the book, is just a very practical question to ask. And I think it's a good question to ask whether we're talking about sex or we're talking about gender or we're talking about truth or freedom or any of the other things that's promised or that, that's kind of talked about in our culture. And that's the question, what do you mean by that? The importance of defining terms, not assuming that because me and my teenager or me and my, nephew or grandkid are using the same vocabulary that we're necessarily using the same dictionary. Right. When I say freedom and they say freedom, listen, freedom today is a myth. Freedom today means a free-for-all. That's the quickest way to become an addict. If you just kind of live as if there are no boundaries, sex means something when people use it. Gender means something when people use it. Truth means something. And a very powerful tool with our kids as they talk about these things is just to stop, create a dialogue, look them in the eye and say, hey, wait a minute. Before we go on, what do you mean by that? Talk about, like, for example, marriage equality. Right? You and I have talked about this before in this program. But before we say marriage equality, let's define marriage. What do you mean by marriage? We throw that word around as if we mean the same thing. Clearly, we don't mean the same thing. One understanding of marriage is tied to procreation. The other one is tied to adult happiness. These are very different ideas about an institution. And defining the terms is a huge part of increasing that baloney detector and helping kids think from a Christian worldview about the world that they live in.
And again, you have chapters on sexual orientation and gender identity, and that's really important to kind of define the terms and understand that. And this is, again, one of the great challenges, John, because I would have to say that a lot of parents that are older or grandparents listening right now said, I never really needed to talk about these things with my kids. And now it's front and center because you got kids that are watching on the TV set or they're maybe finding something on their smartphone and they're asking you questions that you never thought that you would be able to answer. So again, one of my solutions is to make a point of going to the Colson Center, going to Breakpoint, and finding out what has already been written because you've done a lot of good research to help people figure out how to answer some of those really tough questions.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Kerby, and that's exactly what we're trying to do is try to give people resources. That's one of the reasons we kind of talk about the changes and the upheaval and the different shifts that have taken place in culture is because I would have never thought, even when I got married, this would be my 15th anniversary with my wife. Even when we got married, I would have never thought that I was going to have a conversation with all three of my daughters when they were at the time, 9, 7, and 5, about same-sex marriage. But I didn't have that choice. The government made a decision, the Supreme Court made a decision, and the president had made a decision previously to evolve, and so on, famously under the last president. And suddenly, if I don't have that conversation with my kids, the culture's ready to have the conversation with our kids. And for us, we think about issues having to do with sexuality as kind of being issues in the city, on the coast. Our kids know the transgender issue, not as an issue, but they know it by name. There's a name that they're thinking of, a friend at school, somebody that we know. We can't wait for the conversation. We got to get ahead of it.
Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with our friend John Stonestreet right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. An editorial penned in the Tampa Bay Times has called for one of our clients to form a league of their own. The author writes about Cambridge Christian School, who earned the chance to play for a state football championship game against another Christian school. Both teams asked the Florida High School Athletic Association to pray over the public address system prior to kickoff. That request was denied by the FHSAA specifically because the requested speech was religious in nature. The author supports the FHSAA. He writes, if Cambridge and similar schools want public community prayer before their state championship games, they should leave the FHSAA and form their own private statewide Christian association and stage their own playoffs. Now, we were once told that if you wanted to pray in school, you should go to a private Christian school. These students did, but now that they are there, this author would have them leave the league entirely. Well, where does it end? Must religious picnickers form their own private parks lest they be accused of violating the Constitution for saying grace over their meal at a public park? It was the FHSAA that engaged in religious discrimination against Cambridge Christian School. It would be an even greater offense to the Constitution's protection of religious liberty to force these students further from public participation. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John Stonestreet with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, A Practical Guide to Culture. He's the co-author and, again, helping the next generation navigate today's world, and it's published by David C. Cook. And let's, if we can, talk about entertainment. It's one of your chapters there, and it seems to me that that's a big challenge because we have a generation that is come to expect that entertainment is readily available. Those of us old enough remember a time when if you wanted to see entertainment, you had to get up and turn on the television set, assuming you had a TV set, or you had to get on your skateboard or get a ride to the local movie theater. But now entertainment is everywhere. And that's why I think it's really important, as Kathy Cook and you and others talk about, the need to really begin to monitor screen time, because young people spend an entirely too much time in front of a screen, don't they?
Yeah, no, that's right. We actually hit this issue on a number of levels. I mean, one is just that level is just like information is a poor substitute for wisdom. Screens and, kind of the illusion of connectivity that we get through screens and texting and social media, it's a poor substitute for relationships. And that's one of the things that happens in an age of screens is that kids actually don't look each other in the eye and they don't develop deep, meaningful relationships. One of the more practical things that parents can do is just have screen-free zones. And I'll tell you two that are really important. One is the bedroom. Just because of a number of issues. Safety from pornography is one of them, but just even getting a good night's sleep. The other one is just dinner time. Have a screen-free dinner time, not to mention, while you're driving, because you shouldn't text and drive so you don't die, right? I mean, that's the third one. Yes. But the entertainment issue is also other things. Every movie, every song, every television show is also communicating to us ideas. And so one of the ways that culture changes before it changes from law, before it changes in any sort of political way, is it changes in the imagination. And the stories of a culture are communicated through our entertainment, through our songs, our movies, our stories, our television programs, and they can be very, very powerful in changing the way people think about essential issues. Joe Biden said this a couple of years ago, that Will and Grace, that television show from the 90s, did an awful lot to change the way people thought about sexuality. He's exactly right. I don't often agree with Joe Biden, but I think he's right there, is that before we got, the Obergefell decision from the Supreme Court, we had television programs and stories in Modern Family, that were changing the way people thought. So the temptation of entertainment is movie comes on, brain goes off. Television show comes on, brain goes off. And so that just keeping kids, again, baloney detector, their discernment up, creating a habit in your household that you don't just watch movies, you talk about them. You don't just watch a show, you talk about them. You're willing to stop and say, well, wait a minute, before we go any further, let's clarify this. And, of course, at times just being willing to just turn it off. But there's a third aspect of this, Kerby, and not only just that it gets in the way of relationships when too many screens take over our lives, not just that there's messages that are there. The third is just that it can be a distracting force from what's really and truly important. It's amazing. You can stop the average person on the street and ask them to name 3 Supreme Court justices, and they can't do it. But they can name the 3 or 4 judges on American Idol or on The Voice. What happens to a culture when we know far more, not just a little bit more, but far more about our entertainers than we do about our leaders? As one of my friends often says, in other countries, heroes make history. In our country, they make CDs and touchdowns. So we can be captivated, as Neil Postman wrote, we can be amused to death. We can be captivated by the trivial. But we don't want our kids to mire in triviality. We want them to think on higher things. And so we've got to be intentional about entertainment in that way.
I might just mention, when you talk about teaching your kids to engage entertainment, sometimes I get calls, John, from people saying, well, my kids are really young. And so then I've recommended maybe Lael Arrington's book, World Proofing Your Kids, or Natasha Crane's Keeping Your Kids on God's Side. Some of these are really aimed at even the younger generation, but certainly if you have kids in middle school and high school, this book is perfect, because what you want them to do is not just sit back, turn on the TV set, or go to a movie screen and veg out, but to actively engage in that entertainment. And if they do so, that's a way to really begin to develop that worldview and develop, as you could call it, the baloney detector that Philip Johnson and others talked about, because that's what we're going to need in this 21st century, where we're just hit by all this information. We really need a worldview to make sense out of all of it.
Yeah, we do. In fact, the 4th section of the book really is a toolkit. I mean, yes. At some level, we're trying to address specific issues that we know we're going to face. But on another level, if we sat down our kids right now and said, hey, here's all the ethical or moral or life challenges that you're going to face for the rest of your life, it would be a fool's errand. We have no idea what's on the horizon, any more than our great-grandparents, knew about, postmodernism or radical Islam or Justin Bieber, right? I mean, We can't know what's going to come. And so there's a framework, there's a set of tools that need to be in place, and we address a number of those. But let me also hit this one, and this is sprinkled out through the entire book, and that is, it doesn't matter what our culture says about how the generations are divided, and then how, the old people are separate from the young people and so on. It doesn't matter what's said. Still, the most important people in the life of the next generation are parents and mentors and educators, and especially parents. There's no substitute for it. So all of this truth communication, all of this teaching of discernment and the baloney detectors and so on, they have to be done in the context of strong relationships. And so the biggest thing we're trying to accomplish is intentionality, giving folks through this book a set of resources, tools, ideas, teaching, strategies that they can turn around and use tomorrow. We wanted it to be what the title said, a practical guide, not just because it's usable, but because then parents don't have an excuse. We can jump into the life of our kid and make a difference.
Again, first section deals with why culture matters. We've talked about some of those lower and undercurrent issues, reading the cultural waters. We've been working our way through some of those cultural waves. And of course, as he mentioned just a minute ago, Christian Worldview Essentials on how to read the Bible, how to trust the Bible, the issue of pluralism and taking the gospel to the culture. Just a very helpful, practical book, over 300 pages, published by David C. Cook, and we have information about it on our website. You can probably find it in your local bookstore as well, and we have a link to the Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and of course we always encourage you to go to Breakpoint and find out some of that information as well. So, John Stonestreet, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. I look forward to the next opportunity.
Hey, absolutely. Thanks so much, Kerby. Appreciate you guys.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we'll have our Friday weekend edition. We have a lot to talk about. Of course, we've heard a little bit today from James Comey and the former FBI director and some of the statements he's made, and we wanted to certainly get into that in more detail tomorrow. We'll see what some of the commentators have had to say about it as well, so that will be certainly front and center. We have been monitoring the fact that we are in this month of Ramadan, and it has been very dangerous, and so we want to get into some of those issues as well. Then we'll certainly get into some of the topics that don't get covered very often, but need to. There are very important issues before the legislature, before Congress, before the president, foreign policy issues, and much more that we will talk about. So all of that will take place tomorrow on our discussion, our Friday weekend edition. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to get some of the information that you've talked about today, we've posted all of that. First of all, we have one of the columns from Robert Knight, who was with us in the first hour, From Suppression to Coercion. We also have the end-of-day report from just a few days ago by Gary Bauer, dealing with the Ramadan rampage. And then, of course, we've posted information about a practical guide to culture and encourage you to find out a little bit more about those resources. So that's all we have for today. I hope that you will join us tomorrow. It is our Friday weekend edition, and that's when we will certainly open up the phones to give you a chance to join our conversation and participate with us as well. I want to thank Andrew, Melissa, and Elisa for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We will see you back here tomorrow.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.